Alright. Gonna make a quick preview video, actually. Well, I don't know how quick it'll be, but I'm gonna make a preview video right now about the three relatively big upcoming fights this weekend, all of which involve world title fights, 2 unifications, if you will, and 1 solitary world title fight. Those fights are gonna, of course, be separately main events. But the first fight I want to talk about is, of course, George Kambosos versus Devin Haney. This is going to be Kambosos' first defense of his unified, I guess, 3.5 titles. Haney's going to be making the 3rd or 4th defense of his WBC title. 3rd, because he defended first against Gamboa. He defended next against Linares, and he was elevated in October of 2019, I believe. Or no. Am I right about that? I think so. Whatever the hell the WBC is out there doing with them. But yeah, he was elevated around that time, I know. And, of course, he made his first defense, I believe, against Gamboa, and then against Linares, and then against Jojo Diaz. Now, both guys are coming off of a pretty good string of momentum. I'd say Haney is coming off of his career best win against Jojo Diaz, which isn't saying much because Diaz is, of course, a smaller fighter, coming up initially from featherweight, however, cementing himself, replacing Ryan Garcia before his fight against Javier Fortuna, and actually managing to defeat Fortuna by a rather comfortable unanimous decision. And then, subsequent to that, he managed to secure a title fight against Haney. I believe Haney was initially looking to fight Ryan Garcia, or one of those guys, and that fight fell through, so Jojo, of course, stepped in, I believe, with 7 weeks to go. Put up a pretty good account of himself, made the fight quite competitive, but Haney's length, size, volume, and things of that nature were enough. In the case of Kambosos, his claim to fame was just his last fight. Before that, he was mainly hanging around fringe level. His previous 2 fights had been 2019 against Mickey Bay, and then 2020, October the 31st, against Lee Selby. And then subsequent to that, November the 7th, I believe, no, November the 27th, or 28th, of 2021, against Teofimo Lopez, the unified champion in the division, coming off of a career victory against Vasily Lomachenko in a fight where he was outskilled. However, he was able to make up the difference for that by using his height, his reach, his size, his weight, those certain advantages very well. He fought a disciplined fight and was able to weather the storm late on to secure a unanimous decision victory. Loma entered the fight seemingly injured, but he entered the fight unprepared, no delays, and he was ultimately unprepared coming in and cost himself. So Teofimo became champion. Teofimo made the same mistake, fighting an undisciplined and very miscalculated fight against George Kambosos, suffering seemingly from emotional problems, actually, due to problems with his wife, and of course his financial situation between he and Triller, which had obviously escalated to the fight falling apart initially, and then eventually it was the IBF that decided that Matchroom, who were the second highest bidder, were going to attain rights to the fight. And then Teofimo entered the fight, wanted to make a very brief statement, got floored, and Kambosos boxed very, very well. Showed in that fight, actually, to me, that he was a better boxer than many people gave him credit for, but actually his back foot game, in regards to his footwork, is seemingly much more effective than his front foot game. His previous 2 performances were both split decisions against back-footed boxers, Mickey Bay and Lee Selby, guys who were trying to keep him at the end of their jab, and he was unable to cut distance quick enough against those guys, and was consequently giving up rounds. Now, winning rounds, though, I will say, Kambosos does have a decent defense, was using a bit of a cross-armed guard, and keeping an active guard and moving his head a fair bit, able to slip, dodge, and escape a lot of Lee Selby's shots. And not a lot of clean punches were actually landed by Selby, but because of the fact that he was just unable to close the distance and how slow his feet were on the front foot, he was unable to get off enough work to convince the judges in a lot of the rounds, and consequently it was a split decision. I felt Kambosos won both of those fights, though, against Mickey Bay and Lee Selby. I thought he won the Selby fight rather clearly, if you actually want to evaluate what does and does not land. He fights Lopez, in my opinion, catches him on an off night. In the case of Lopez, I actually thought he caught Loma on an off night, but ultimately, that's their faults, that's their wrongdoings. Kambosos is the guy who's ultimately, to this point, been the most dedicated and was able to capitalize on their mistakes, and hopefully for him, he doesn't make the same mistake here. Enjoying the fruits of his labor, I suppose you could say. In the case of Haney, he's someone who is a pretty good counter puncher, but actually likes to take the lead a bit more. Very, very good jab. Is good at controlling the distance, and what I will say is he does use pretty much every bit of his reach. He's got good punch selection, got an underrated body attack. I think a lot of people underestimate his body attack in regards to how effective he was able to be, especially in that Linares fight. He's good at pinning guys' guards down, and he's just an excellent outboxer. Very good from the outside. However, I think he's a bit one-dimensional. I do think he's chinny, and I think the weight cut is costing him to a certain extent, he's robbing himself of a bit of punch resistance that could be there by cutting a lot of weight. And another thing I will say is he does tend to fight a bit timid. He does tend to lose his shape, lose his balance when he gets hit. When he gets hit, he tends to tilt his body over, fall over against the ropes, and oftentimes exacerbate the impact of punches coming towards him. Also, oftentimes fights with his chin in the air, doesn't always use his shoulder roll as effectively as he could, and a lot of the times gets caught with overhands over the top of his shots, even by shorter opponents like a Jojo Diaz. And of course, because of the fact that he doesn't really feint enough, he doesn't really feint a lot of power shots, he really only uses a pawing jab to try to disguise his work. He consequently allows for, guys like Santiago to have success against him because he's unable to cut distance and make them, second guess. He's a very reflex-based fighter. Kind of like a somewhat of a poor man's impersonation of Floyd. I think the way this fight is probably going to go, to be honest, is Kambosos is going to be pretty typical Kambosos. He's not going to be looking to take the lead. He's going to be looking to, take command of the center of the ring. He's going to try to catch and shoot and counterpunch off of Haney's jab specifically. Because as I mentioned, Haney doesn't really use his shoulder to really protect his chin a lot of the time. So I think Kambosos notices that, when he points out the fact that he sees Haney's flaws. I think that's one of them. And he's going to try to come over the top with overhand rights. A lot of those shots, too. I think what Haney's going to do is he's going to use the extra size, the reflexes he has on him, his clinch work, so that when Kambosos tries to initiate off of the overhand right, if he's not able to catch him before he's able to land that shot with his superior reach and hand speed, of course being off of the lead hand, or maybe a straight right hand counter, what he's going to do is he's going to try to lean in forward and grab hold of him so that he gets underneath Kambosos' right hand so that it can't arc high enough to get to his chin, or low enough, should I say. I think he's going to be able to do that and have success for the most part the whole night. I think Kambosos will have success. Haney does tend to languish on the ropes and get a bit too caught up in fighting in the pocket. One thing about him, his work doesn't really flow. It's very static. He tends to... It's not like he's really multitasking. He's setting up one shot, punching on the move. He doesn't really do things like that in the ring. When he's punching, his feet are typically set. When he's moving, he's not usually feinting or coming back with anything. It's all kind of just one thing at a time for him. So Kambosos is going to have success. He might be able to stun Haney over the top with a big right hand, but in terms of just physical size and Haney's distance control, and the fact that Kambosos' feet are too slow, especially when coming forward, for Haney to be able to, or for him to be able to trap Haney against the ropes with the frequency that he needs to in order to be able to, rack up enough points, especially if the fight goes to a decision. I think this is going to be a decision victory for Devin Haney. I think Haney's going to win a decision, something like 9 rounds to 3, 8 rounds to 4. He might get hurt once or twice in the fight, because he has been hurt before, of course, as we've seen. As an inside fighter, Haney's shown strides. I think he needs to go back. I think, especially in this fight, excuse me for the rain, I think especially in this fight, he's going to need to go back to his inside fighting tactics a little bit. I'd like to see him do such things. Because against Juan Carlos Burgos, especially when Burgos was able to, crowd Haney and get past his jab, and I think he's worked on his distance control since then, so I don't think it'll be, quite as much of a necessity. But at the same time, I think he needs to get back to some of his inside fighting tactics, because he did show the ability to actually fight and work out of clinches in that fight. So I'd like to see Haney do a bit of that, but I think sticking and moving behind the jab, a jab and a pivot will be enough, to be honest. Kambosos has a chance, but I'm favoring Haney. And politically, as far as, favorable scorecards for the hometown fighter in Kambosos, I'm not particularly worried about that. Because there are no Australian judges, apparently there's an American referee, and Devin Haney has the backing of Top Rank behind him. Next fight I want to get into will be the first defense of Stephen Fulton's unified titles, second defense in totality against Danny Roman. This is another fight that's this is a fight that's not too difficult for me to predict, I don't think, but I think nevertheless will be very competitive, maybe even very close. I think it actually will be pretty close, to be honest, on the cards. Because Danny Roman brings elements out of both Angelo Leo and Brandon Figueroa that were both able to trouble Fulton. I don't think he hits as hard as Figueroa, so he won't really cause Fulton as much damage in regards to, potentially hurting him over the top. But I do think, however, that Danny Roman's ability to cut the ring off to an extent, his counter-punching ability, his inside fighting ability specifically, are both crucial elements, especially into potentially dragging Stephen Fulton into a fight that does not potentially favor him. Fulton loves an inside scrap. One thing about Fulton is, and I think Devin Haney actually had this similar problem until he eventually ratcheted it up before the Linares fight, I'd say. Fulton does not really have a consistent enough jab. It comes at the same pace, at the same speed every time. Against Danny Roman, he's going to need to show more variance on the jab. And because of the fact that he oftentimes forfeits the distance as a result of that, and the fact that he's a pure counterpuncher, doesn't really like to take the lead, Fulton loves an inside scrap, and he's a fantastic inside fighter. He is tremendous at fighting off the ropes. But he also lacks the one-punch knockout power, in my opinion, to be able to get Roman's respect. However, I think early on in the fight, especially considering how much Roman struggles against guys who have longer reaches than him, can keep him at distance. And I'm specifically mentioning the Juan Carlos Payano fight, with how much trouble he was having being able to land the straight right hand clean, where eventually his fitness was able to carry him on into the later rounds. And of course, Akhmadaliev had him struggle, to be able to really get inside and get off his work consistently. while Akhmadaliev was able to unleash his combinations and pot shot from the outside. I think it's going to be a very similar story early, and I think that's ultimately going to cost Roman in a close fight. I think later on in the fight, Fulton's going to get dragged into a bit of an inside fight, and I think Roman is going to start to really give him problems, start to win rounds, possibly consecutively. I think it's going to be a tale of two halves, but I think the first half from Fulton is going to be more dominant. And I think Fulton's going to be able to compete with Roman on the inside more so than Roman being able to compete with Stephen Fulton on the outside. I think Fulton's counterpunching, his fitness is going to be enough for him in this fight. I think Roman's going to struggle early, and that's where the difference is going to be made. Now, the final fight I want to talk about is Joe Cordina versus Kenichi Ogawa. Going to be a brief little preview on this fight. Joe Cordina, neither guy really impresses me as a fighter. I wouldn't really consider either guy to be top 5 in the division. I mean, you might have to rate Ogawa there based on the fact that he, of course, beat Fuzile for the belt, but in terms of skillfully, I don't really see it as such. I think Cordina probably has the edge in skill. Ogawa has the edge in overall physical gifts and his pedigree. He has fought Farmer before, which he won by a split decision in a fight I didn't really consider to be a robbery, but it was overturned, of course, due to a failed drug test. He's since drawn with, Joe Noine, and of course, subsequently, as an underdog, went into the Fuzile fight and pretty much whooped his ass. Fuzile was, in my opinion, really had poor tactics in the fight, was rather unprepared for what Ogawa was going to bring to the table. Because for a fighter of Fuzile's style and build, that's a rather straightforward fight. You got to be consistent on the jab, you got to throw in volume to keep Ogawa off, because he's not someone who's going to cut the ring off, but he is someone who's going to look to stand in the pocket, get you, in his area code to land his counters, his straight right hand counter specifically. And Fuzile was just getting dropped all around the damn ring. Because of the fact that his jab wasn't, like I said, consistent enough, he wasn't doing a good job controlling the distance, and he was basically looking to pot shot him and fight him the same way he fought, Martin Joe Ward. And, Ogawa as a front foot fighter, and as a power puncher even, no, not as a boxer though, but in terms of his mettle and as a front foot fighter, he's more of a threat, of course, than a Shavkat Rakhimov, who's rather crude coming forward. And, of course, he got the sniffing salts, but Ogawa largely won that fight as a result of Fuzile's poor tactics and his inactivity. Like I said, that Martin Joe Ward fight was the only fight between the Rakhimov loss and the Kenichi Ogawa title fight. In the case of Joe Cordina, I don't really rate him. He's got some recognizable names on his record. He has Gavin Gwynn, he's got Miko Kachatrian, he's got Farouk Kurbanov. The Gavin Gwynn and Kurbanov fights, both he struggled in. Cordina is someone who has a decent boxing ability, but also tends to get, drawn into dogfights with guys who are especially lesser opposition than him, but I think he was doing a bit better job of fighting more discipline in the Kachatrian fight. For me, if a gun was to my head, I would probably lean towards Cordina to win by decision. But once again, if Cordina gets dragged into a bit of a dogfight, if he gets dragged into a mid to close range type of an affair against Ogawa, of course Ogawa stands a good chance to knock him out. He'll have to ratchet things up and be defensively responsible, but I think he'll bank in enough rounds on the scorecards. And of course, with the fact that he's the home fighter, I think it's a straightforward fight for him in terms of tactics, but as long as he gets them right, I think he should win a pretty competitive unanimous decision in this fight. But I could also see Ogawa scoring a late stoppage. So that's really how I see these 3 title fights going this weekend. Let me know what you all think. Have a good one.